It's time for a change. This Republican presidential slogan helped Dwight D. Eisenhower become elected President of the United States on November 4, 1952, defeating the Democratic Adlai Stevenson. Despite some dangerous moments during the Cold War, people often remember the days under the Eisenhower administration as happy days with no direct war or depression to worry about. With new technology and a booming economy, America truly flourished. Nevertheless, the Eisenhower years weren't completely carefree, since he had to deal with some controversial domestic issues, a majority of them being civil liberties associated.
In June of 1953, Malcolm X was made the leader of Temple No. 1 of the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X was an African Muslim leader and a very influential figure in the civil rights movement. He was a member of the Nation of Islam, an Islamic religious movement that aimed for helping African Americans extricate from the misery of racism through its culture.
One of the most notable court cases in the history of American civil rights had been the Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka. On May 17, 1954, U.S. Supreme Court, in the case of Brown v. Board of Education, overturned a separate but equal doctrine from Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. They declared that the racial segregation in public schools was inherently unequal and violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which stated that no state was allowed to deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of laws. Though this decision was limited to public education, it implied that segregation as a whole was unconstitutional. The case was a huge victory for NAACP since they strongly advocated civil rights for African Americans despite struggles. The case's decision, however, was denoted as a Black Monday by U.S. Representative John Bell Williams. The court's unanimous decision was written by Chief Justice Earl Warren, the same person who had pushed for Japanese Americans' internment during World War II as California's Attorney General.
The Brown v. Board of Education spurred the formation of the White Citizens Council, also known as Uptown KKK, composed of urban middle-class whites. Its first meeting was held on July 11, 1954, in Mississippi. White Supremacist Network, with approximately 60,000 members across the U.S., opposed racial integration of schools, supported segregation using intimidation tactics, boycotts, firings, and violence. On April 11, 1955, Roy Wilkins became the executive secretary of NAACP, and on May 31, 1955, in Brown v. Board of Education 2, the Supreme Court ordered that schools were to be desegregated with all deliberate speed. Its vagueness allowed for those against the decision to delay or resist integration. For example, infuriated by the decision of the Supreme Court, white citizens' councils forced the state governments to fund private school tuitions for white children who left public schools to prevent integration, and in Virginia, they refused state funding to the integrated schools later on.
Regardless of the great step taken for the civil rights movement through the Brown decision, white resistance did not disappear. On August 28, 1955, in Mississippi, a 14-year-old African-American teenager, Emmett Till, was brutally murdered by Boy Bryant and J.W. Milam because they took offense at the way he talked to a white woman. Bryant and Milam soon were put on trial, however, were acquitted immediately by an all-white jury. On September 23, 1955, an all-white jury declared Bryant and Milam not guilty. This ruling sparked anger across the nation and ignited the civil rights movement even further.
On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks, a department store worker and a longtime NAACP activist, was arrested in Montgomery, Alabama for refusing to give up her bus seat to a white man. This gave cause to the local black women's organizations and civil rights groups to organize a boycott of the city's bus systems, led by Martin Luther King Jr. King hoped to awaken people about the immorality of Jim Crow laws and combat racial segregation through nonviolent protests. He kept on fighting for the cause, inspired by the Indian revolutionary freedom fighter Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, despite of the difficulties that were sure to follow. And on December 5, 1955, King delivered a speech at Holt Street Baptist Church in which he described the mistreatment of African Americans on buses and urged listeners to help in on the peaceful protest.
On January 24, 1956, Bryant and Milam confessed to murdering Emmett Till in a paid interview by Look magazine. Despite their confession, they were never formally punished due to protection by double jeopardy. Following this, on February 3, 1956, Lucy enrolled as a graduate student in library science. and University of Alabama, becoming the first African American ever admitted to a white public school or university in the state. She attended her first class on that day. However, merely 3 days after she started attending the school, anti-integration riots began in front of the school. Lucy later was unfairly suspended from the university, with the justification by the university being that Lucy's safety was a concern.
On March 12, 1956, 19 senators and 82 members of the House of Representatives signed the Southern Manifesto. Had attempted to reverse the Supreme Court decision from Brown v. Board of Education, calling it a clear abuse of judicial power. In the document, integration in public places, particularly school, was opposed and states were encouraged to resist implementing the mandates from the Brown v. Board of Education case.
On June 4, 1956, shortly after the Montgomery bus boycott in Browder v. Gill, the district court ruled bus segregation in Montgomery, Alabama unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. On November 6, 1956, recovered from his serious illness, Republican Dwight Eisenhower was re-elected president in the elections against Democrat Adlai Stevenson. On November 13, 1956, the Supreme Court upheld Browder v. Gill, striking down laws calling for racial segregation on buses. On November 15, 1956, African Americans united during the boycott and maintained their stand throughout bringing the bus companies to bankruptcy and forcing the Alabama Supreme Court to declare bus segregation laws unconstitutional. About 1 month later, the Montgomery bus boycott came to an end.
Eisenhower is inaugurated for a second presidential term, while Martin Luther King Jr. became the first president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Later in that year, on September 4, 1957, Little Rock Nine sparked a nationwide crisis when they first tried to enter Central High School, Arkansas. Little Rock Nine was a group of 9 African American students who entered Central High School despite the Arkansas Governor Orville Forbes warning the African American students a day earlier on the television not to enter the high school. A few days after, Eisenhower signed the first civil rights legislation after Reconstruction, called the Civil Rights Act, creating the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Although this act wasn't really effective, it was another federal recognition of the centrality of civil rights. On September 24, 1957, Eisenhower sent federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas to enforce racial integration in schools after Forbes opposed the decision made in the Brown v. Board of Education case. The president's actions were significant since it also was the first time after Reconstruction that the president sent military troops to the South to enforce a federal law.
In Eisenhower's second year, on June 23rd, the president met with the African American leaders Martin Luther King Jr., Roy Wilkins, Philip Randolph, and Lester Granger. In April of the year 1959, Mack Charles Parker was an African American victim of lynching and was shot in Pearl River County, Mississippi, and thrown in a river 3 days before his trial, and nobody was indicted for the shooting. In the same month, MLK also visited India with American Friends Committee and other supporters and became even more deepened by nonviolent resistance. He later published his book, The Measure of a Man. Despite these significant events, there was no direct action in the fight against civil rights in 1959. However, on the international scale, the U.S. did recognize Cuba under Fidel Castro and admitted Hawaii and Alaska to the Union. This influenced the 1960 election.
In the winter of 1960, a group of 4 African American college students were asked to be served at Woolworth's Lunch, Greensboro, North Carolina. However, they were refused service. These students did not leave their seats and started sit-in protests. These protests rapidly spread across the country, and about 50,000 students all over the nation joined. Later in the spring of 1960, the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who had been responsible for organizing the sit-ins, was officially founded. In May of 1960, Eisenhower signed the Second Civil Rights Law, which only had a few advances over the earlier law. That September, Fidel Castro gave a speech at the UN, having supported the African independence and liberation, speaking in statements of solidarity with the black struggle in the U.S. In spite of this historic speech on October 19th, Martin Luther King Jr. and dozens of other individuals were arrested during a sit-in protest at Ridge's lunch counter in Atlanta, Georgia. In the November of 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected president thanks to the votes of over 70% of African Americans. Kennedy overall was sympathetic towards the civil rights movement, but not devoted to it. He understood the negative impact of racial inequality, but also knew that disaster would occur if he did not appeal to the conservative Southern Democrats as well.
On January 20th, 1961, JFK gets inaugurated and delivers the most quoted presidential speech of all time.
Oh, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Almost half a year later, on May 4, 1961, the first Freedom Ride took place as 13 members of the Congress of Racial Equality, a nonviolent civil rights organization, organized freedom rides throughout the South to test the Supreme Court's rulings banning segregation on interstate buses as guaranteed in Boynton v. Virginia, and in travel facilities as guaranteed in the Supreme Court case Morgan v. Virginia. They later traveled from Birmingham to Montgomery and were violently attacked by a mob of more than 1,000 whites. This sent shock waves through the society, evoking a fear of social disorder.
In the beginning of 1962, James Meredith enrolled as the first African American student at the University of Mississippi, also known as Ole Miss. Although there were marshals on the campus, riots did take place, resulting in Kennedy sending federal troops to handle the situation. This then caused Kennedy to order the Department of Defense to integrate the National Guard in every state. The following month, President Kennedy issued Executive Order 11063. This prevented racial discrimination in the sale of houses that were legally owned by the government or have a contract with the federal government.
In April of 1963, Project C was initiated. MLK, the SCLC, and the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights united to launch a campaign of mass protests called the Birmingham Campaign or Project C, in which C stood for confrontation. In this movement, people, whether they were children or elderly, attempted to emphasize the need for integration in Birmingham, Alabama through various efforts such as organizing boycotts and sit-ins. In the spring of 1963, MLK issued his letters from Birmingham jail after being arrested along with others in a protest for parading without a permit. On June 10, 1963, John F. Kennedy federalized and deployed the National Guard troops to the University of Alabama to force its desegregation, and by the next day, June 11th, the university was successfully integrated. By force, Governor George Wallace ended his blockade of the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, and 2 black students, Vivian Malone and James A. Hood, were enrolled, breaking Wallace's promises of segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever made during his inauguration in January that year. That same day, President Kennedy made an address on civil rights due to the civil rights movement growing stronger and tension in the nation increasing. In his address, President Kennedy acknowledged American citizens on the television, describing the injustice that Black Americans experience and proposing a civil rights bill. A day later, in the early morning, World War II veteran, NAACP member, and civil rights activist Medgar Evers was shot by KKK supporter Byron De La Beckwith.
On June 19, 1963, Kennedy sent a civil rights bill to Congress requesting to end segregation in all of public facilities, safeguard voting rights, and to form a community relations service and extend the life of the Commission on Civil Rights and prohibit federal funding of programs that practice discrimination as well as guarantee equal employment. But it was never passed under JFK's presidency. Then came the historic March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. 250,000 people, both black and white, marched to Washington to rally for voting rights and equality for African Americans, as well as the end of segregation and racial discrimination. On the steps of Lincoln Memorial, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his legendary I Have a Dream speech, in which he explained the struggle of African Americans and his vision of a future of a racially equal America.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed.
However, on September 15, 1963, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham happened when 4 members of the KKK attached at least 15 dynamite sticks beneath the front steps of the church. 4 girls were killed in this attack and many others were injured. Also, in the beginning of November, Malcolm X delivered his grassroots speech describing modern slavery and the March on Washington. As the year 1963 came to an end, on November 22, 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas by Lee Harvey Oswald.
Despite Kennedy's assassination, the civil rights movement was not hindered and only grew in strength and power under Lyndon B. Johnson, helping shape the United States into the nation it is today.